Hello, welcome to Varn Blog. And today we have Djene Bajalan and Kuba. You're gonna have to say your last name.
You can, we're friends. You can just call me Kuba or Doctor or
Yeah, Dr. Kub. Okay, Dr. Kuba and Dr. Djene. And we're talking about the situation in Palestine. And particularly, we're going to try to give some context for it. And we tried to have a larger panel, but pretty much every Palestinian expert I know is either dealing with Eid or in high demand. So I figured some general foreign policy experts would work for this. So, Kuba, what do you think is the primary thing driving the timing of this particular escalation?
well, the situation in Israel-Palestine is perennially tense. You have conditions that, with the smallest perturbation, can lead to serious confrontations and leadership on both sides that politically benefit um, from violence and from being able to tap into the rally around the flag effect. It's particularly opportunistic. It's a particularly opportune moment for Benjamin Netanyahu. He's been dogged by corruption allegations, and the situation in Israel is politically uh, in flux. The but it's we should also think about the fact that the pressure on the Palestinian population, especially in the West Bank and the areas around Jerusalem, has been ratcheted up. Um, the um, what's being described as evictions from Al Jarrah is just the latest phase of a kind of death by a thousand cuts of Israel finding pretexts and justifications to encroach more and more onto Palestinian territory and expel the population. So the it's not it's not surprising that this broke out, and there could be marginal reasons why the confrontation happened now and not a week from now. Things like the fact that this is Eid and there's um, a lot of Palestinians with um, that are celebrating the holiday. They're also not eating all day, so that could lead to people just being fed up more easily. Um, and the Jerusalem days, likewise on the Israeli side, another mobilizing factor for nationalist sentiments and can easily play into anti-Palestinian aggression.
Yeah. So, Djene, would you like to add anything to that in the initial context here?
Yeah, I think Kuba's largely right. I think we can find factors within Israeli domestic politics which meant that Bibi Netanyahu, whether he initiated this crisis or whether he's been led by the settlers, is not going to let the crisis go to waste. We saw the police using force on Palestinians in Palestinian protests at the Damascus Gate, in the Al Aqsa Mosque. You had the Israelis, forcing people to walk to the Al Aqsa Mosque as well for extended periods. So you had this kind of ratcheting up of tension. You had this flashpoint around the Israeli High Court's decision to allow sort of move ahead with settler claims on properties in East Jerusalem, a legal precedent which is an interesting one for the Israelis to open up, because it's based on the fact that those houses were occupied by Jews before 1948. But of course, Palestinians who have had their properties expropriated on the other side of the Green Line don't have the same legal standing. So, this is, it seems that Bibi was able to use this crisis in order to basically cripple attempts to form an Bibi government. There have been several elections recently in Israel. It looks like Israel is heading towards a fifth election, and
I hear rumor that there might even be a right-wing Islamist party that's in coalition with Bibi's government.
There's been talk about the role of various Islamist parties working with Bibi, but also the Joint List as a silent partner in the kind of anti-Bibi coalition. But Israeli politics is somewhat Byzantine due to the nature of their electoral system, and also because of the disproportionate power that settler groups have within the Israeli political system. It's important to remember that Israelis, on both sides of the Green Line, vote for elections in the Knesset. So you have some extremely hardline groups that can hold the balance of power in Israeli politics. Now you have Bibi, of course, is kind of a Trumpian type figure, and someone who is under, has been under indictment, and there's all kinds of corruption allegations against him. So this kind of rally around the flag really benefits him. But on the Palestinian side, there's also a reason for Hamas, for example, to ratchet up the tensions. You have delays on the Palestinian elections, the election for the Palestinian authorities, and these protests, which broke out, seemingly kind of organic protests, anger at this ongoing sort of daily humiliation the Israelis subject Palestinians to. There's a desire to assert political leadership, show themselves to be the leaders of Palestinian resistance, and they're kind of a symbiotic relationship between Bibi and Hamas in a kind of perverse way, not in a coordinated way, but in a perverse way, because each of them legitimize the other.
Yes. Looking at the makeup of the Knesset right now, it seems like it is both, not just in the ruling government, but also in some of the opposition, is overwhelmingly right-wing. Labor seems to be down as little as I've ever seen it. And I haven't heard any reports that it's likely to gain any seats in the next election. So, it's actually quite hard to follow Israeli politics. When you say Byzantine, there's at least 13 parties, and you have micro affiliations based on religious and ethnic sentiment. You have different parties based on whether or not you're Ashkenazi or Sephardic or Mizrahi, whether or not you're Haredi or modern Orthodox, etc., and so forth. And these vote in micro blocks, so it does make it particularly hard to predict. It also looks like there's a Kahanist in the Knesset, which is an interesting development. So you have some of the most far right-wing elements actually in power. So even though Bibi seems to be barely holding on to power, there doesn't really seem to be like any way for like a leftward shift. I guess maybe like the remnants of Kadima or whatever could overtake him if they had the right coalition, but it would be a very strange coalitionary government.
Well, I think that we just need to acknowledge that the Israeli left is irrelevant, and that the public sentiment has coalesced around everybody who is in a position of responsibility likes to say two-state solution because it's a great alibi. It's a wonderful smokescreen and excuse not to change anything or not to address ugly, visible realities. But I think that it's the population at large. It's dawned on everyone that there's not going to be a two-state solution. We're not getting rid of the settlements, and this not only that, but this one-state approach, this harsh approach of Benjamin Netanyahu, has kind of worked. The violence that was occurrence that impacted the lives of Israeli Jews on the Israeli side of the Green Line during the Intifada, during the second Intifada, when they were at risk. You couldn't You had suicide bombings in cafes, this kind of thing, attacks on public buses. That has been successfully pushed, entirely outsourced, if you will, entirely transplanted into the occupation. The coercion and violence occurs on the Palestinian side more or less exclusively, apart from these rocket attacks. And so for everyday Israelis that don't really have a stake in a larger eschatological vision of a united grand Israel, or don't have a lot of investment in big political projects, the fact that they don't have to worry about their safety, the safety of their loved ones, that's a big win. That's an improvement on the previous status quo when the two-state solution was still viable. There's a hardening of feeling against Palestinians that's undeniable. But also a wonderful forgetting. They're on the other side of the wall. We don't have the IDF deals with them. It's not a problem anymore. So why do we need to fix anything, right? It's working for us. That's like the unacknowledged truth of the occupation. And as a result, any party that has a pledge to break from the occupation status quo, the security status quo, they have an uphill battle, because for pragmatic Israelis that don't see this as a kind of moral imperative, or don't put their own interests ahead of Palestinian interests, and you can't really blame them for that on an individual level. The abandoning the harsh occupation entails a risk of returning to personal danger, returning to attacks within the territory of Israel, empowering groups that, and the Israelis understand what has happened in the Palestinian occupied territories. They know kind of what the IDF, what the settlers have done. So there's a feeling that, well, they probably hate us. They probably want to kill us. They probably would seek revenge if they could. So, I mean, sorry, but like, better you than me. And within that tendency, you have every party that you can imagine, in terms of identity, in terms of economic orientation, in terms of religious affiliation, but they're all within that, occupation forever type of framework.
Yeah, and I would add, what is perhaps disturbing about this latest round of violence is that it is spreading to within the Green Line. So what we've been seeing is, to my knowledge, hitherto unseen sort of levels of violence between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish Israelis.
Pogroms.
Yeah, basically pogroms. And at times there are leading political figures who are stoking this. Obviously you have other political figures who are saying, no, this is not good. But, in many places, and, there's a kind of nod and a wink from the authorities. Now, I don't think the Israeli state wants to let these kind of pogroms come out of control. I think there is enough sort of, there are people within the military establishment and the political establishment of Israel who don't see pogroms as a good thing. But it's, insightful to think that there are elements within the Israel, not far right nut jobs out of the political system, but people within the political system who see some kind of utility to this kind of violence against the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So I think that is a particularly concerning development, because Palestinian citizens of Israel are about 1/5 of the population. So what is becoming kind of extremely concerning, at least from the Israeli perspective, I think, is that this violence might spread within Israel, inside Israel, whereas, for the decade that Bibi's been in charge, as Kuba points out, a lot of this violence has been externalized. Rocket attacks are obviously terrifying, but they're relatively ineffective. I would take my chances in Israel as opposed to certain parts of Springfield or St. Louis. Walking around even with the rocket attacks, but obviously they're terrifying, and for Hamas and groups like that, it serves as a kind of sort of way of consolidating their political power
and also catharsis.
And catharsis, that's what it is. It's like kind of the violence of desperation. And for the Israeli side, it's, perhaps for some unscrupulous politicians, it's a useful reminder about why, in order to justify why the security situation and methodologies that the Israeli state use are relevant.
Yeah, so go ahead, Kuba.
I just wanted to quickly build on the idea of the weakness of the Israeli left. And I think that one phenomenon, one development that is underappreciated is the fact that there's been a sorting of Israeli peaceniks and more conservative Israelis, where since over the last 10, 15 years, kind of like once it became clear that it was going to be Netanyahu, for the foreseeable future, and that the nationalist line had hardened within Israel, left-wing Israeli Jews have, to a certain extent, voted with their feet. It's easy. It's easy if you're Israeli to get citizenship in the United States. It's easy to move to other advanced countries where you can live quite comfortably. If you have, it's a strong educational system. People have professional opportunities abroad. They're used to traveling because Israel's a tiny country. So, like in some American states where you have a separation based on political affinity, I think that the population of Israel has changed. It's not just the minds of people have changed, but the makeup of the Israeli population has changed, with more, peace-oriented Israelis leaving and being replaced by some of the most radicalized, conservative Jews from the United States and from other Western countries. And, Benjamin Netanyahu hasn't been shy about doing fear-mongering tours of Europe to try to stir up some, more Ashkenazi immigration into Israel. And the ones that he gets, right, are not going to be assimilated peacenik hippies. The ones that he gets are going to be the ones who are activated on identitarian issues.
Yeah, they're either right-wing nationalist to Haredi, which is Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews. For those who don't know what I'm talking about in Israeli terms, one of the other factors that I maybe want to piece apart, though, is the Palestinian political situation, because the indefinite suspension of the election, where it looks clearly like Fatah is going to lose a lot of what little bit of power it has left in the government. For those who don't know what Fatah is kind of the moderate wing successor organization to the PLO, and Hamas seems to be gaining more in popularity in Palestine and both territories. And so before even this happened, we had President Mahmoud Abbas postpone the election. So it seems like there's also internal pressures in Palestine to that make this really, really hard to see how they would even come. What incentive would any side have to anything like detente right now? Particularly given that there's going to be no relaxing of the settler issues, and a moderate group like Fatah is going to have a hard time having any kind of influence there. Particularly when you look at the history of the way Hamas has been developed and its ability to, before it took a lot of power in Palestine, its ability to serve as a lot of the social institutions. I mean, model after Brotherhood, and more effective than the Brotherhood because of how, deteriorated a lot of the Palestinian infrastructure has become, particularly in the last decade. And I've been like, I don't really see. I think if you have that election, anytime in the near future, you will see there'd be every incentive for Israel to become even more aggressive because there'd be more likely to be, more Hamas power in government.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to when you had the elections in the early 2000s that led to the split in the Palestinian Authority, Hamas's success was as much to do with the ossified and corrupt nature of the leadership of of Fatah and the Palestinian Authority as it was to do with Islamism. Islamists, especially in the early 2000s in many parts of the Middle East, were seen as clean hands administrations. They were seen as individuals not tarnished with the sort of corrupt, the corrupt failure of secular pan-Arabism, which had sort of dominated in the 60s and 70s. And we see this across, we see this as a broad tendency across the Middle East, the growth of the Muslim Brotherhood's popularity in Egypt, the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. These, Islamist popularity were often related to, the failure of secular nationalist elites in the second half of the 20th century to provide economic growth, clean administration and employment and opportunities. And that tendency, of course, hit the Palestinian Authority, which, in addition to having a kind of corrupt political leadership, which, if you think about Oslo from a sort of personal psychological perspective, these guys in the PLO, they'd been exiled from their homeland, and this was their opportunity to come back, right, and to assume some form of power, however, truncated and limited it was in Palestine. And, they consolidated political power. And when you had this election pushed by the Americans, it wasn't the only other group that to be, relevant and organized were the Islamists, were Hamas. And Hamas was successful, but of course, that opened the door for the split between Gaza and the West Bank. And so in addition to kind of like growing discontent at what is seen as a kind of comprador administration in the West Bank, one where you have like political leaders who are, living opulently while the rest of the population is, in a very poor situation. For many Palestinians, they say, well, Hamas may not be perfect, but they're less corrupt. They provide social services when they can, and also they resist. So, the Islamists have kind of, the Israeli policies and the failure of the PLO have really enhanced the position of groups like Hamas, which obviously thrive in many ways from this conflict.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
And also, your question was whether or not greater role for Hamas, more successful election results in favor of Hamas would lead to more aggression on the part of Israel. I don't think that that's a determinant. Yeah, it doesn't matter. I think I don't have any sources on this, but just looking at how Israel is operating in the occupied territories, it seems you can see the outlines of the strategy. And one, make Gaza unlivable, choke it as much as possible, destroy as much as possible when you have the pretext to do so, prevent anything from being rebuilt, make sure that services are terrible. Why? You want them to leave. You want to make the situation so terrible that as many Palestinians as possible either enter Egypt or go elsewhere. Maybe even some kind of migration scheme facilitated by the international community.
But
In the West Bank,
would Egypt even allow that many Palestinians in?
oh no, I mean,
Yeah.
but that's the thing. If you make it bad enough within Gaza, then they'll enter illegally, right? And it doesn't matter if they get killed by Egyptian border guards, because that's also a solution. And the West Bank, which is the territory that you want, it's the territory that has value. There, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Lawfare, expulsions based on security pretexts, wall building, settlements, whether recognized legal settlements or the wildcat settlements that you can then retroactively legalize. And eventually you'll be able to take it all, right? Piece by piece, it's salami slicing. And at the end result, you have all of the territory that Israel currently controls under Israeli jurisdiction forever. And the pressure placed on Palestinians, ultimately is part of that policy in trying to incentivize emigration. Ultimately, that's kind of the solution that hardliners always favored. Let's just get rid of the Palestinians. Let's have a two-state solution, but the second state is Jordan, right? It already exists. They can all move there. We get everything on this side of the Jordan River. And what they couldn't do at once, they're achieving piecemeal. And the two big hurdles in the way is one, any movement to legalize Palestinians as Israeli citizens. If you have a one-state solution, if you have a single Israeli state, but 50% of the population is Palestinians because you've given them all Israeli citizenship, well, now that's a problem, because unless you're going to abandon the electoralism that's a hallmark of Israeli democracy, then you're going to have to cut some kind of deal with them. The other is that your pressure triggers enough of an emotional response so that it materially hinders your security and your ability to maintain control over the territory. And they're managing both, right? There's laws, there's discriminatory laws, as well as the ethno-state law that was passed as a kind of ideological platform, which are designed to limit the power, influence, autonomy of Palestinian citizens of Israel, regardless. They have citizenship, but it's not the same as Jewish citizens. And the very aggressive attempts to corral, limit, harass, criminalize the BDS movement is the strategy to prevent the kind of international encirclement that helped cripple apartheid-era South Africa.
I'm generally supportive of the BDS movement, but I've always had one major caveat about it, and that is the Israeli arms dealings, which are way more effective than anything South Africa ever could have done. It seems, it is interesting though. I guess this is a good pivot to the rest, to how to handle this internationally, and because when you talk about the on the ground right now, it really does seem pretty hopeless.
If you talk about it off the ground, it also seems pretty hopeless.
Yeah. I mean, consider this, right? The pro-Israeli, spokesmen or individuals will often highlight, how humane the Israeli occupation is compared to the other states in the Middle East. And I find this like a very interesting claim. They go, well, look, Palestinians, if they were living under Bashar al-Assad or, under Saddam Hussein or the Saudis, if they did half of what they did, they would be murdered and annihilated, which on one level, there's a kind of truth to it, right? You look at some of the regimes that have existed in the Middle East and the level of brutality that's involved, like in terms of kind of level of intensity, it is, objectively speaking, worse. But that speaks to the difference in the kind of strength of the state, the difference between the concept of a strong state and a fierce state. Weak states often have to act, in a fierce and violent way, the kind of gendarme state, in order to maintain their power and legitimacy. So the violence meted out by the state is an expression of that state's weakness. Israel is in such a powerful position. The military balance of power is so much in favor of the Israelis. They have the luxury of being able to, deploy violence far more selectively and in a kind of less haphazard manner, and the kind of manner that would perhaps elicit a greater response from the international community. Because we see the Israelis doing all kinds of things in Gaza, but it could be worse. They could just fly airplanes over there 24 hours a day in Gaza and drop barrel bombs on everybody. There's always a way to ratchet up the violence. But I think when we talk about the kind of the way that the Israelis deploy the violence, that is an expression of the strength of the Israeli state. Mm-hmm. If the Israeli state was ever in a weaker position, I think we would see a kind of an intensification of violence.
Yes, and one thing that Israel has historically been very good at is finding proxies to do their dirty work for them. And one thing that's essential for Israel, or it was in the past, it seems to be less and less important, is the perception that this is an enlightened, modern, Western-style state, that these are people like us, that share the same values as us, meaning the West, and that therefore we should instinctively side with them against the Muslim hordes at the gates. And that was extraordinarily effective, but it precludes certain types of coercive strategies which would be too obviously atrocious, too obviously violent, too obviously scandalous. When the camps in southern Lebanon, I want to say Kabila and
Shabira,
when the atrocities, when the population there was massacred, the Israelis controlled the area, but the actual killing was carried out by Lebanese Christian phalangists. And I think that Israel right now, to a certain extent, it's the most hated that it's ever been in Western circles, but it has the strongest position in the Middle East that it's ever enjoyed. The Gulf states are beginning to, it's an open secret that they're cooperating with Israel. Egypt has been neutered for decades already.
The Camp David Accords and its specific agreement. I mean, people don't understand how much the Egyptian economy is actually dependent on the U.S. military trading with it, and how,
basically aid in the Suez Canal.
Yeah, that's what, and a little bit of natural gas out in the White Desert, but like that's, having lived in Egypt, I was amazed at how much you got aid and how much that aid went to buying like old U.S. military equipment that's just kind of laying around, and you just see like old Abrams tanks and like just out and about. And what I found interesting about this, I lived in Egypt in 2015, 2016, 2017, was that was also true during the Morsi government too. That even the Brotherhood like played a stronger rhetorical role towards Palestinian rights, particularly given its historical instantiation and ties with Hamas. I mean, but it didn't actually govern the border differently. And so, yeah, I mean, that's clear. And it's also clear that the Saudis have taken a much more non-ideological, position towards Israel. Although, and Djene and I had talked about this on Ben Burgett's podcast, it needs to be noted that pro-Palestinian sentiments are used by all these governments as a way to gain legitimacy, even though they don't deliver on anything.
Well, there's a cognitive dissonance, I think, between kind of the individual feelings, the individual sentiments of elites as Muslims and as Arabs versus their self-image and their practical interests as regional leaders, usually with strong ties to the United States. Right. So personally, your heart bleeds, especially during Ramadan. How scandalous. Like, how could these Zionists enter Al-Aqsa during Eid al-Fitr, right? Like, how I'm scandalized. I'm shocked. My soul hurts. But we've got Iran to worry about. So,
right.
Like, Mossad is very good at dealing with the Iranians. So,
the United Front that existed against Israel in the 60s and 70s was partly a function of internal competition between the various Arab powers, the so-called Arab Cold War, where you had revolutionary sort of Republican regimes in places like Egypt, and then sort of reactionary monarchies in places like Saudi Arabia, which were in a kind of conflict, and the Palestinian issue was a key lightning rod. But I completely agree. We see it today with Turkey. Turkey has had a kind of interesting relationship with Israel, particularly in the 90s. There was a close security cooperation, particularly within the context of the fight against the PKK. Mossad was involved in the capture of Abdullah Öcalan, and I read Bibi Netanyahu's book on terrorism, I think written in the late 1990s, where he talks about their common struggle against terrorism and things like that. Now, obviously, the sort of Islamist orientated Justice and Development Party is making sort of a lot of hay about tears for Palestine. We saw this with the kind of famous 1 minute moment where Erdogan was like, no, let me speak for the Palestinians, 1 minute, and had this performative outrage. But I read today in the in the opposition Turkish press that as much as Erdogan is complaining about it, trade with Israel increases. This is no different from when the Mavi Marmara happened. If people remember that, the kind of the ship designed to break the blockade of the Gaza Strip. The day after this was, this kind of event happened with the Mavi Marmara ship and sort of Israeli attack on it. The Turkish defense minister announced that they would continue to honor their contracts to purchase Heron drones. And more recently, Israel and Turkey cooperated together in support of Azerbaijan in its war of conquest, in Nagorno-Karabakh. So, there is this, there's this rhetorical use of the Palestinians within Arab and Muslim political discourse, especially for Islamists. But the reality of political power is that, very often this is kind of hollow rhetoric.
It's true. It kind of feels a little like the Palestinian care for solidarity with Palestine is the Muslim world two-state solution. Everybody says it, right? Because it sounds good. It's what people want to hear. It's reassuring. It makes you. It's partly virtue signaling, and it partly closes the conversation because you can't argue with that, right? Or try to introduce nuance. But I question if anybody means it, right? It's a little like Czesław Miłosz talked about the like wooden language, the dead letters of late socialism, where you talked about a worker's paradise, but everybody knew that no follow-up questions, no, don't ask, don't look. I just have to say this. Now we can move on to the real conversation. Similarly, solidarity with Palestinians, 1 minute, 1 minute. Okay, let's buy the drones. Two-state solution. Okay, let's evict Palestinians from Al Jarrah. There's the cognitive the refusal to recognize the reality of the situation is an essential part of not just Israeli politics, but the regional, even the global, I'd say, attitude towards the Palestinian situation. Because realistically speaking, if you care about the Palestinians, help them emigrate.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to save them from the Israelis. You're not. You're not going to Libya, Tel Aviv. You're not going to. It's not going to break. It's not going to break anytime soon. It's if you want to do the work of generations to try to erode the Israeli position. Well, I don't even see anybody doing that. If you want to help Palestinians, move 1 million of them into the United States, move 1 million into Australia, move 1 million into Canada.
Yep.
And they'll have better lives, and they won't have to deal with the Israelis anymore. But you're giving Israel exactly what it wants, and now you've got 1 million Palestinian immigrants who are extraordinarily traumatized, many of whom don't speak English, and you have all the problems of assimilation that come with first-generation immigrants from a vastly different society. It's going to be expensive, it's going to be difficult, but that's the solution, right? That's the way out for Palestinians. For Palestine, it's over, right?
Yeah, well, that's pretty gloomy, but we are at an impasse because I would put it a different way.
We're not at an impasse. The Israelis are getting what they want. They're winning.
Yeah, but nobody's willing to take the Palestinians. Nobody in the Middle East will take them because that will upset demographic balances and sectarian balances in their own countries.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a poison pill that nobody wants to take.
Yeah.
And Western countries aren't about to open up their borders. The Syrians were bad enough for the Germans to take in. That's had a huge backlash there. So, it's, ultimately, I think that, I'm neither an Israeli or a Palestinian. And, at the end of the day, these people have to find a way to live together. But
they don't. They can kill each other.
Yeah. I mean, they can kill each other. But on the other hand, I think there's an issue of we're at a kind of point where the old dream of the two-state solution is dead, right? People.
Was it ever viable though? I've actually thought about that for a long time.
Was it ever viable is an interesting historical question. Was Oslo ever sincere? Were the offers made? Was this like the Taba offer? Like, was that the best offer that was ever going to be made? Are these missed opportunities? Those are historical questions. But at least during the 1990s and early 2000s, there was perhaps more of a hope that this question, we're like rumbling towards some kind of solution, and the two-state solution is going to be viable. It's just a matter of time. That solution is dead, right? People cling on to it either delusionally or disingenuously, but no alternative vision has been articulated, right? You could foresee a situation where, let's say, the dominant political paradigm in Israel amongst Palestinians shifts from being, violent resistance and sort of a two-state solution to demanding, you start seeing peaceful mass protests for citizenship, right? Now, whether we'll get to that point is a different thing, but that kind of shift in political ideology,
it would actually be calling the Israelis bluff, right?
it would be if the Palestinian leadership says, okay, 2 states is dead, we demand full integration of the West Bank and eventually Gaza into a federation or some kind of, but we aren't at a point where that vision, which some intellectuals do articulate that vision. I don't think we're at a point where that's coming into being. So we're in kind of this limbo hell where things can get worse, but there are ways that things
They're hypotheticals.
Hypothetically could get better. So I don't want to be super gloomy, but I tend to agree at this present moment the material basis of a Palestinian state has been annihilated. Even people who were formally committed to a 2-state solution have this contradiction where it's like, well, okay, what does a Palestinian state look like? Their vision is not a sovereign state. And then when you say, well, that's not a sovereign state, it's like, well, why would you expect that we would give them a sovereign state?
It looks like, at best, the Navajo reservation.
Yeah, it looks like Navajo reservation. So it's sovereignty over people. Israel maintains like final say on everything. And the Israeli justification is, but how can we trust these people? And it's like, well,
we know what we've done.
That's what it comes down to. It's like, we don't want our country to turn into Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's like, I get that.
And it probably would.
Yeah, if you suddenly did everything right now, it probably would turn into Bosnia-Herzegovina, and that's a real thing. But the point is, the Israelis aren't willing to concede 2 states. You could probably get a peace with a return to, however imperfect, with a return to 67 borders, some kind of deal over the holy sites in Jerusalem, but proper Palestinian sovereignty, maybe a treaty with the Palestinians where it's like, okay, Palestinians, you have sovereignty, but you can't have like F-15s or something like that, right? But that's not even on the table, right?
No.
That's not even on the table.
It's not, because the balance of power has shifted so strongly to the Israelis. And like I said, it's not just the Israeli state that has benefited, that has reaped the rewards, but regular Israelis don't have to worry about being blown up if they go to a discotheque. That's a big deal. And that's a big improvement. And that it's hard to ask people to go back to conditions of personal insecurity. The ones for whom the moral or ideological justification would be worth the risk, they live in Brooklyn or LA now. They don't live in
or Berlin.
Or in Berlin.
LA or Berlin. Yeah.
There's been Jewish migration into Poland again, right?
Wow.
Not a lot, but it's a European country. We're better now. So there's a lot of places where, if you're not a hardline nationalist, if you're not ultra-Orthodox, or even if you are ultra-Orthodox, but
you're a Satmar, not a religious Zionist. Yeah.
Exactly. You can live very well and with a strong sense of personal security. You don't need the previous generation, and we talked about this a little yesterday on TIR, but the previous generation, the sort of baby boomer American Jewish generation, they had been raised on the heroic underdog narrative of scrappy, capable Israel. And they had also had the horror stories of their parents about what happened in Europe, what they faced in case things should turn in Western countries, and blue-eyed anti-Semitism. Jews will not replace us. Tiki torch anti-Semitism were to come back full force. And for that generation, Israel was, on the one hand, like an example of Jewish strength, capability, achievement, and on the other, refuge in case of there was a repeat of the horrors of mid-century. The support among American Jews of that generation is for Israel is durable, and it's around 80%.
Yeah, it's ubiquitous. I mean,
yes.
as a person who used to go to conservative and reform shul, it among a certain generation, it is ubiquitous that it drops off precipitously around age 40.
Exactly. And that's the generation of American Jews that were raised at a remove from the both scrappy underdog Israel. They remember Benjamin Netanyahu, asshole Israel, and also at a remove from worrying that Kristallnacht could happen to them, right? Like, you grow up, you look around, and it's like, maybe I do bump into a couple of anti-Semitic assholes from time to time, but generally speaking, the non-Jews seem perfectly friendly, and even some of them are more Zionist than I am, right? And like weirdly into me being Jewish.
Right.
Yeah, so like anti-Semitism is socially unacceptable nowadays.
Well, yeah, although I will say,
in a way that it wasn't in the 50s, right?
Oh yeah, true.
Compared to anti-Semitism, there's still a strain of anti-Semitism in all Western countries on the political right, and to a lesser degree on the political left. But the kind of like overt anti-Semitism that used to exist, in the 50s and 60s, just it's not the same as it's
no,
it's
not.
It feels like it's simmered down to the everyone. There's somebody who hates any group level,
right?
Like, there's anti-Koreanness, there's like anti-Polonism. We have a word for it because we're a very resentful and suspicious people. But yeah,
and the rise of hostility towards Islam as well has also shifted attitudes towards Jewish people, because suddenly Jewish people become seen as an ally in the fight against like the barbarous Muslim hordes. So even on the political right, there is a kind of like split between the old school kind of Pat Buchanan-esque anti-Semites, and then there's like religious Zionists, but not everybody who's on the right and pro-Zionist, like evangelical Christians. You have like the kind of general sort of right-wing reflexive support for Israel, which is seen as a good bulwark in the Middle East to advance American interests.
Well,
the irony is that that's the constituency that has filled the gap in Jewish American support for Israel, right? As the figure that I recall from the public opinion surveys is like 40% of American Jews under 40 support Israel, and the rest are like either ambivalent or anti-Zionist.
Mm-hmm.
And compared to like the ubiquity of their parents' generation, is like a shocking decline, falls off a cliff. But you have a ramp up of Christian Zionism that more than compensates.
Yeah, and I think people think this is a historical Protestant position, but it's not. It's a thing that happened in the 70s.
Yeah, it's a weirdo third awakening type thing.
Right. One of the things I think has also affected Jewish perception of Israel is like, I think a lot of the people who support Israel are actually, who are not Jews, are more likely to be anti-Semitic, frankly. And there's this weird, I hate to use the old Marxist canard of dialectic, but I think it is, where Israel itself kind of needs the stoking of anti-Semitic sentiment in the diaspora to A, increase immigration, and B, justify its existence as this long-standing tension starts to fade. and what my pushback on Djene about anti-Semitism was just like, I have seen it increase in my lifetime as a person who, I have, significant Jewish heritage. I'm not technically halakhically Jewish if you're Orthodox, but
I don't think either one of us are.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I've seen this uptick.
I mean, they're Nazis now, right?
Yeah, there are actual Nazi, and weirdly, actually, because I've studied the far right since I was a paleo-conservative in my 20s, right? They quit speaking in code. So in the 90s and the aughts, the paleo-conservatives and the people to the right of them, the like ethno-nationalists, spoke in strong code. And
didn't want to get David duked.
Right. In the last 5-10 years, that code has been dramatically lessened. However, you've also seen a lot of parties that were traditionally anti-Semitic embrace Israel because they now see Islam as the primary Semite problem. I'm thinking of in India, the PKK has
BJP.
The BJP, excuse me, not the PKK. That's you guys.
You're a fascist too, Orban.
Yeah, and Gulam Fay around Greca, which is European New Right, which is a fascist organization, or at least quasi-fascist organization. There's a strong faction that has embraced Israel as a way to fight off the Muslim threat, and also, ironically, as a way to get rid of the Jews peacefully. There's no longer a need for a diaspora. You can go home, and we don't have to deal with you anymore. Is the other undertone? Yeah, but I think your point about no one taking Palestinian immigrants en masse and doing refugee relocation is a strong point about a lot of the reason why there really is a global way. Well, this is a speaking point even for places like Russia, and well, not really. I mean, and China, they don't really care. And in fact, certain balances could be undone by any change in the status quo. Even in the case of Russia, which doesn't seems to be very concerned about the Sunni populations on its border and in some of the Russian Federation, being able to like hook up with anything in the Gulf. Hence, their kind of strategic support for Iran has, part of it's historical, but part of it is also that's a geopolitical aim. They would have no incentive to take a bunch of Palestinian refugees of any significant size. Europe definitely won't do it. And you're right. I can't even imagine like what nations would at this point. I don't even imagine like Muslim nations in Africa don't even seem to be particularly open to it. I'm not just talking about Egypt here. So,
I mean, there's also the status quo situation in the Middle East, and with the Israeli occupation of Palestine being part of it. Right now it's comfortable for a lot of major players in a way that makes them hesitant to, loathe to find any kind of resolution. Because if you undo the Palestinian-Israeli conflict one way or another, then it's going to reconfigure regional politics. The last reconfiguration was the American invasion of Iraq, and that worked out great. It's a multipolar region with no power strong enough to be able to seize the opportunity of an Israeli Palestinian solution in its favor, and instead it would create a tremendous amount of disruption for everyone else. And the truth is that no country, unless your population is starved for some reason, no country wants refugees. If you do need a population coming in, if you do need more people, then you want people as similar to the population you already have as possible. So the Europeans took in 1 million refugees during the kind of like the 2015 wave, and they're still kind of processing that. It's a difficult lift. The countries that and not only that, but like with the Palestinians, we're talking about people who have opted to stay, who have strong connections, who are also horribly traumatized by the experience of the occupation, by maybe they're suspicious of outsiders, maybe they're hostile to the West. They haven't had opportunities necessarily to get the kind of education which would make them easy to settle economically. It's a really hard lift to take in a large number of Palestinians. But from a humanitarian perspective, if you really care, then that's what you do.
I think yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, thinking back to what Djene was saying about the Palestinians demanding incorporation into Israel, which would essentially be the same as Israel accepting 3 million Palestinian refugees. I don't think that Israel is going to let the Palestinians demand everything. Their only play might actually be unconditional surrender, right? Like, let's just acknowledge that the war never ended, and that we've been fighting you guys ever since, ever since the 1973, and you've won. Like, congratulations. Like, what do you want us to do? Are you gonna kill us? Do you want us to get on the cattle cars? Do you want us to move to camps? Just tell us what you want us. Let's get the UN here so they can see what you decide to do with us. But it's your call. You've won. Like, it's clear to us that we can't really stop anything. We can lob a few missiles at you, but whenever you want to take our homes, you can. Whenever you want to kill us in the streets, you can. Whenever you want to destroy, or violate sacred space, you can. So surrender. I think that may actually be the only play.
Because it would force the international order's hand, unfortunately.
Yeah, the Israelis could no longer be like, no, two-state solution. No, we want peace, right? Like it would all come to the surface, and it would actually be kind of traumatizing to the Israelis, because there'd be a lot of subconscious realizations that would then have to be like looked at in the face. The problem is that how are you going to get an entire people to collectively decide to do that absent some kind of state apparatus that could impose a decision on them? You don't have that. And not only that, but
I mean, the Israelis have specifically, intervened in Palestinian politics to ensure that there is no consolidation of
Palestinian. They're smart. They're good at this. They know what they're doing.
This is one of the most sophisticated, it's like best practice of all ethno states. don't genocide people. That will get a reaction. You do it slowly, legally, bureaucratically.
Yeah.
Like people talk about Yitzhak Rabin as
Don't annex territories too, right? They could have annexed Gaza and West Bank, but they didn't, precisely to deny Palestinians the standing to become to be protected under Israeli law.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, it is very similar to like the status of Native Americans, but when they were subject-dependent nations under the law in the United States in the early 20th century. It's a very similar tactic. And what worries me is there is a strong analogy to indigenous people in the U.S. and Canada and what's going on in Israel, Palestine. And one of the lessons from that is if you draw it out long enough, by the time you acknowledge it, it won't matter.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if you draw this out over 100 years, you can acknowledge it, and all your liberals can feel guilty and talk about how they're on Palestinian land and acknowledge the Palestinian, but it won't matter anymore. It becomes a symbolic gesture of a past trauma. And I mean,
fair. I gotta stick up for the man, in this case, Canada. There have been land claim settlements in the favor of First Nations. It's more than symbolic lip service.
Yeah, well,
in America, in the United States, it's very much more symbolic lip service, though.
Yeah,
Canada is better than the United States, but that's not a really high bar to.
Yeah, on this issue, it's really not a high bar, and I don't know. I will say the legal the Crown actually, in specific, even more than Canada, has been very good at actually settling and maintaining treaty rights and whatnot. But I will also point out the average lifespan of Indigenous people in Canada being like 20 years less than the general population.
No,
so,
you're I'm not
No, but I get you. It's not what the United States did, and I specifically like the subject people's law. That's unique to the U.S. That's not a Canadian thing. And that was reversed in the 20s, but by that point it really didn't matter. And even though all Indigenous Americans technically have citizenship, they have no political autonomy on the reservation. I mean, it literally requires an act of Congress to repair a pipe. I mean, like, it can be, it's not already adjudicated for in the Bureau of Native Affairs. So, like, you can see how anyone who has studied that could definitely know how to use that in the case somewhere else. I mean, and the U.S. has largely gotten away with it, and Israel thinking it might too. What I find interesting
is the population is too large. It's not the same when
right.
you don't have
2/3 of the population dying from smallpox. Yeah.
And that's also the nightmare scenario for Israel, right? Like, I think there's a quote by Yitzhak Arafat who says that our nuclear weapon is the Arab womb, and the idea was that you outbreed Israelis, you create a Muslim Arab majority in the occupied territories and Israel, and then you can use that demographic position to both demand democratically, a share of power, and also you outnumber them. So you can use human wave tactics if you need to. It's threatening being a minority, and the Israelis are also eager to diffuse that potential time bomb, partly by encouraging the most fecund segments of the Orthodox settler community to have as large families as possible, and also make the lives of Palestinians as miserable as possible to get as many of them to leave as and maybe you can get that infant mortality rate like nice and can we get it like 20%? So the population you can only get to a Native American reservation style endgame if you can have that big
Big
cut
slice.
moment.
You need a
Like
great diet.
COVID.
You need a
If
great diet.
COVID were your smallpox, then maybe you could get there.
Mm.
But there's too many of them for that to be a viable endgame without large scale population transfers. Or, you know, you can just kill them, but like,
But
I don't.
it is quite interesting that now the kind of liberal Zionist, the liberal Zionist sort of wing of Israeli politics is now very increasingly hard to exist, right? That kind, the kind of mythology that existed in the past doesn't exist anymore, and increasingly Israeli politics, its political discourse is orientated towards this kind of like social Darwinist survival of the fittest, which is quite quite openly being expressed. So who knows what kind of solutions we might get to in the future. But so long as the Israeli state is secure and the military balance of power remains so overwhelmingly on its side, we will see this kind of piecemeal violence. The kind of like, we'll break their arms, we won't execute them. Kind
Yeah,
of.
and I think that the we've seen a hardening towards
Mm.
nationalist reaction globally. It's not just Israel, although I think Israel may be maybe a forerunner, maybe.
Yeah, they seem to be like 10 years ahead on the nationalist reaction thing, maybe even a little ahead of Hungary.
And I think that this is also associated with climate change anxiety and the increasing likelihood that the combination of like population growth in vulnerable poor countries together with climate change is going to create, um, in Europe, the period at the tail end of the Roman empires in German is called the Volkswanderung, the
Mm-hmm.
wandering of the peoples. And you can imagine, um, as states break down in like Iraq, like Syria, but also like Congo. You don't necessarily need an outside push if it's vulnerable enough. And the climate changes, and you end up with harsher and harsher conditions in populate in countries in Africa, places like South Asia as well, the Middle East. You're going to have this phenomenon of south to north mass migration, millions of people on a continual basis. And
Yeah.
there's, and how do you cope with that? And I think that for a lot of kind of conservatives or even liberals that have a very strong connection to a particular national identity, it's like, well, we can't let them in.
And we see this in our own border.
So what the Israelis will do to the Palestinians may be the dress rehearsal for what's done to climate refugees on a much larger scale by many advanced countries.
Yeah, we also see, we already see the Israeli police force. The IDF trains American police, right?
But that's because they're just friends, though.
When you say
hang.
this, you get accused of being an anti-Semite. It's like, how dare you say that the American police are being trained but they literally are. They're literally. So I think a lot of these methodologies pioneered in Israel will be transferred to different parts of the world. It's a very sophisticated security apparatus, right? It is very much an ideal type of ethno state, right? You have the kind of the ratification of Nazi race laws becoming the basis for Israeli citizenship, quite understandably in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And you have like a very sophisticated security apparatus, a hierarchy of citizenship, that serves to stop the the oppressed group from coalescing into sort of a a united front. And I think we will see these kind of things spreading to different parts of the world. The types of controls that we see in Israel will become more and more common in other parts of the world, especially as Kuba says, climate change. Kuba mentioned the Volkswanderung, the movement of people, a process that didn't really end in the Middle East until the 15th century.
And not only that, but like, if you were one of the groups that let them in, it might not have ended well for you either.
Well, yeah, look at this is the kind of scenario that Camp of the Saints is all about, right? That this like right-wing book, which I find fascinating because it is a racial book, but there is like an Indian sort of character who joins the Camp of the Saints. He's like, "Come on, guys, let me in. I hate Indians too." And
I hate them more than you do.
I hate them more than you do. So they have their, Israel has its kind of like has Druze and Arabs who are loyal to the state, and that they can use against Palestinians in a kind of divide and conquer moment. But at the end of the day, as much the last line of kind of liberal defense of Israel is like it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the last. We've come to the point where it's like, well, guys, it's really complicated. It's like it's not very complicated, right? You have like a land dispute, and you have an ethno state.
The complication comes from the fact that if you settle it, then how do you coexist, knowing what you've done?
Yeah, right? That's the root of the solution. Is the complex thing. The fundamentals of why there is a conflict is not that difficult.
Oh yeah, it's very straightforward, and it's also very straightforward who's suffering, right? Like there's a tremendous amount of oppression, and there's a tremendous amount of brutality, and there's a tremendous amount of misery that's being inflicted on, and it's not going both ways, right? There's one set that's comfortable and one set that suffers greatly, and but all the power is on the side of the comfortable ones, and there isn't a great deal of like, where would a settlement come from? I'm not a settlement, but where would a solution, where would a resolution come from?
Let's just say you had you say the U.S. intervened and took a strongly anti-Zionist position, which is highly unlikely for a variety of reasons. But let's just say that in one party there's enough, anti-Zionist sentiment that it becomes politically advantageous for the U.S. to do that. I'm not even sure that would matter now. That's like, this is like, yes, I know the U.S. has a ton of influence over Israel, and our support of Israel was always in pretty much our own interest. That's, the people who peddle anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about, why the U.S. backs Israel need to be not so much listened to in this, but if we ask ourselves, what could the U.S. do? And so if you have massive disinvestment, I guess that might do something, but for what? I don't really know.
Like, maybe what you could do is, if the Israelis kind of carved out a two-state solution, mm-hmm. and actually pulled back enough settlements to make the West Bank semi-viable in either on its own or with some kind of economic relationship with Jordan, the United States could take the role of peacekeeper or bully enough of the international community so that they would play the role of peacekeeper, and that way you get the Israelis out of Palestine, while at the same time having someone to prevent Hamas group, someone to prevent the very predictable trauma and anger and resentment and from becoming a threat to Israel, because no matter what, Israel's going to get away with like stealing a whole bunch of Palestinian land. Even if you go back to the even if you go back to the Green Line, right? There's a lot of 1948 territory that was once in the hands of Palestinians. They're not going to come back.
Yeah.
Ever.
But I think 67 borders with compensation for Palestinians would probably be a viable solution at this point if the Israelis would go for it. But they wouldn't. They're not going to go for it. They're not going to share sovereignty over Jerusalem. It's just, it's just not. It's just not going to happen.
You're right. Also, anything that the Israelis would go for, which might be like 1967 plus Jerusalem, plus we get all of Jerusalem, is going to leave enough anger, pain, and like rage, legitimate rage among enough Palestinians so that that state would be a threat to Israel, right? Like there's no path to reconciliation that doesn't take 3 generations and needs a whole lot of high touch management.
Yeah.
Like imagine the sort of like woke HR speak that it would take to be like, okay, we know that, Yitzhak's family killed your brother and demolished your house, but you guys are going to be partners now, like solving crimes in Ramallah, right? Like, how do you get coexistence between people who have had this experience side by side?
It's hard for me to imagine. And when I think about like Egypt, and even after the Arab Spring, just with the tensions between the army forces and the people who supported that, and the people who were soft supporters of the Brotherhood. Yes, they have to sit down at the table and go to lunch with each other every day, but it explodes out in other ways, like the killing of Copts, because it's an ethnic minority, seen as sympathetic to the military for protection against an Islamist government, and also that's very convenient for the military when they do kill Copts, because you can invoke the national security law. And so again, you have and that's in a place where there was nowhere near the scale of historical violence that's happened in the last 40 years. And I mean, this was made very real for me when I lived in Egypt, because I taught, rich Palestinian refugees, because that's who they'd let in. And one, I kept my I kept any ethnic heritage background pretty secret. And two, I had kids that were shell shocked. They had severe CPTSD, and they would be fine 1 minute playing like normal kids, and then I had this I taught this Egyptian girl whose family was Palestinian, whose close family was Palestinian, and I think she saw her uncle just shot in the head by the IDF, and every now and then she'd just stare, because trauma's trauma, and I know there's people who think that that trauma's culturally encoded and whatever, but I'm like, it was very hard to see how, like, I don't know how you would ever feel safe around. I mean, like, maybe around Jews, but not around Israelis. And
not around the IDF.
Not around the IDF, right? Like
the most moral army in the world. And that's the line that we get, right?
Oh, I mean, so it's a thing that I really do. I am sort of at, like, I know people think we're being super negative, but I'm like, the incentives for this, if you're looking at this in a political realist calculus right now, are pretty much all bad. and it would take an amazing amount of leadership, or the BDS, which I mean, the irony that Kuba pointed out in the beginning for people who missed it is like, yes, sentiment against expansionist Zionism and the West has ticked up, even amongst, you know, fairly loyal groups, the exception being white evangelical Christians, who, by the way, are massively declining and dying out demographic, so they probably won't be super relevant for that in 3 generations. But then again, in 3 generations, will there be any Palestine left? Is, you know, hard to say.
I mean, also in 3 generations, it'll be the 50th anniversary of the Eternal Brotherhood alliance between the House of Saud and the State of Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's you know,
it does not look very rosy for the future. But you know,
no.
change, politics changes. You know, like everybody's complaining about being blackpilled in the. This is what you tune in. This is what you tune into Varn for. You don't tune into Varn to be told nice things about how everything is okay. This isn't TYT. This is Majority Report. This is, my wife calls Varn's show Theorizing with a Hammer, raw dogging you in the head with a hammer. Because, you know, no messing around. But it's,
well, I mean, Kuba's even more direct than me. So, like,
yes, we found Varn's Varn.
But it is very gloomy in the Middle East, and it's not just in places like look. We've talked about
gloomy in a lot of places.
Just look across the borders of Israel. You go to Syria, you have exactly the same problem. You have a terrified, traumatized population loyal to the Assad government because who is the alternative? It's literally ISIS, right? You know, ISIS type people who will kill you for being an Alawite, who will rape, murder, and kill. And then, you know, for Sunnis, you have like an Assad regime which will like engage in
that will treat you like you're ISIS no matter what.
No matter what. So you have a society in Syria where, you know, reconciliation is becoming increasingly difficult, where, you know, conflicts that were political, that were hot, filtering down to the social level, just like we're seeing in Israel, where you're having like pogroms against Palestinian citizens of Israel. In Turkey today, I saw a video. There was a group of fascists in, I think, Mersin in the south of Turkey, assaulted a Kurdish family for speaking Kurdish in the streets. So we're seeing like social deterioration across the Middle East. You know, like the Iraq War, you know, the social violence that the Iraq War unleashed is now being unleashed in other parts of the other parts of the Middle East. You know, the American destruction of the Iraqi state, you know, blew the lid off Iraq perhaps 10 years earlier than it might have otherwise exploded. But yeah, like look at Syria. Syria wasn't toppled by the United States. You know, the Americans got involved in, you know, this, that, and the other, but it was there was like an explosion of tensions in these regimes, which was exacerbated by things like climate change, things that are only going to get worse, especially with things like, things like Turkey, you know, cutting off water in the Tigris and Euphrates. So it's like, you know, Israel-Palestine is not the only place where this kind of like seemingly irreconcilable conflicts are taking place. Not as the sort of cultural essentialists will tell us because of because, you know, people are still butthurt over, you know, the succession of the caliphate in the after. No, but because but because you have like conflicts that are being exploited along identitarian lines, and you know, those identitarian lines in the Middle East tend to be ethno-religious sectarian lines. Not always, there are different cases, but it is an absolute, you know, it's an absolute basket case at the moment, which is only, you know, made worse by the political economy of the region. Like the rise of ISIS is partly obviously because of the political factors behind it, but like let's also remember what happened to the oil price just before the rise of ISIS. It crashed. The Iraqi state couldn't keep things up, so things flow down to those with favored relations with the state, which is not Sunni Arabs, and so boom, you have like this social violence breaking out. Israel is a high-profile example of this, but I think it's terrifying to think about it as it spreads across this kind of broad region.
Yeah, when you look at Yemen, you look at even Lebanon, like the ethnic and sectarian balances of Lebanon being slightly off kilter makes it kind of, you're always worried about that spilling over too. I mean, in Egypt, the reestablishment of basically, Mubarak Part 2 and Al-Sisi is based off of geopolitical stuff that did manifest in killing of ethnic minorities. They didn't even target like tourists or Westerners. They targeted Egyptian Christians and other minority groups like Shiites. And the reason wasn't because of just sectarian interest. It was actually like those groups were seen as being materially in league with the government, and they were also slightly better off the general population. Very actually similar patterns to like the way anti-Semitism played out in Europe and the way anti-Cop sentiment played out in Egypt. But the military government's been able to use that, but it's a very precarious line that like it can get out of control really fast. And to talk about the chaos element of it, I think climate change is. I think a lot of these states realize that climate change is about to make a lot of their problems a whole lot more volatile. And particularly in the Middle East. So have you seen, I mean, like just what the heat can get in the Gulf now, away if you're not on the coast, is
Egyptian water.
Yeah.
And the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam.
Yeah. And the Tigris and Euphrates with the dams that Turkey has been constructing since the inauguration of the GAP project in Eastern Anatolia. And you better believe that they're going to use these things as a weaponry in the future. People have been talking about water wars for a long time. We're already in the era of water wars. This is already happening. All the attempts to restore the marshes in the south of Iraq have been reversed by basically Turkey cutting off Iraq's water. So we're living in a terrifying period in the Middle East, which is only exacerbated by which in that is the context that we need to understand, like the rise of sectarian conflict, and not in this kind of cultural fantasy. And I think
Team Shia versus Team Sunni.
Team Shia,
Team Jew versus Team Arab.
That is the canard of like dime book Middle East commentary. The real thing is the political economy of the region and the way that sectarian ideologies have been mobilized to provide political legitimacy to the regimes, and the way that people get caught up in that. This is not new phenomena in the Middle East. In the 19th century, the uptick in violence against Christians in the Ottoman Empire is partly, there's socioeconomic reasons related to, legal emancipation, but also the conflation of like Christians with like Christian powers in Europe. For the average Muslim, an Armenian Christian is an agent of the European Christians. They're all the same, right? So, you have, sectarianism is a political development of modern sectarianism is a political development. Nationalism in Europe very often sort of came into existence based on ethno-linguistic lines. There are cases of kind of sectarian nationalisms in Europe, especially in southeastern Europe, but in the Middle East, you have like a combination of language and sectarianism being the basis for nation formation as well. And of course, that's playing out because like a lot of these nations failed you know, a lot of the nation state projects in the Middle East are failed projects, right? You know, Hobsbawm says, it's not nations, it's not nations that build nationalism and states, it's states and nationalisms that build nations. But I think you forgot to add that sometimes they build the wrong nation by the way that resources and politics are organized. So the Iraqi nation, which could have been a viable political project, is a hobbled and incoherent project. Kurds want
sometimes they lose the instructions and like they don't have enough screws, and then they get tired and they have
a disagreement about what it is. So you have, like in Iraq, you have Kurds don't want to be part of the project, and Sunnis and Shias want to build different things with the project. So Sunnis and Shias are like, yeah, we're the Iraqis, but the Sunnis are building a chair, and the Shias want to build a desk. And so, and those two visions for what Iraq's going to be can't compete with them. Why have things broken down along those lines? It's because of a lot of these sectarian problems in the Middle East, they can be traced back to the late Ottoman Empire.
Well, I mean, also
policies of colonial governments, which exacerbated this through institutionalizing sectarian divisions that existed before, but gain a hard form. Like in Israel, Palestine is a perfect example where under the British Mandate, you have two parallel administrations, one for Arabs and one for Jews.
But I think you're letting society off the hook, because these identities also harden and become salient by voluntary association and the creation. Like, nobody forces Iraqi Shia to join up with Sadr, to go to mosque, to belong to the the Ashura groups.
It's dialectical, right? There's a dialect. There are institutional imperatives for this, which in turn are shaped by social imperatives. And you have the destruction of the intersectarian bourgeoisie that might have provided a backbone for these nations.
But because it's dialectical, you can't pin it entirely on the colonial state, right? Like the institutions that the big question that I have whenever I look at a country and I try to determine what's will the American intervention there fail? The answer is always yes, but why? And if you eliminate whatever state apparatus, whatever state elite is at the top, who is institutionalized, who is organized, what groups exist that can mobilize manpower, that have loyalty among their membership, that have some resource gathering capability, and that can ultimately deploy coercion to replace the group that's been deposed. And those types of organizations, like the Muslim Brotherhood, a lot of them are formed organically by people who decide, I'm going to join this group and not that group.
Sure. No, I'm not taking the agency away from Middle Eastern people. But if we look at the states that are doing the worst in the Middle East, right? Places like Syria and Iraq, which are, Turkey and Egypt are pretty bad, but, I'd rather be in Egypt than in Syria right now, right?
Yeah.
The tendency of colonial policies in those countries.
Yeah. I don't mean to take the colonial leaders off the hook, but it's not like everything was fine until Whitey arrived.
I think we have to be, sophisticated about this. The colonial administrations didn't conjure up these ethnic and sectarian divisions within these societies, but they certainly reified them with particular colonial policies due to the particular outlook of colonial administrators during the period. The late Ottoman period had contradictory forces when it came to sectarianism. You had the millet system gravitating towards greater sectarianism identification, but conversely, you had a process of the construction of Ottoman citizenship and the existence of kind of pan-Ottoman legal order that progressively pushed out sectarian institutions from politics. Oh shoot! There's a naked baby here. So. Hi. But yes, hi. Say hi. Do you want to say hi?
Hi. That means you win the argument.
I win the.
I am backing down. I will not.
No, I agree. We shouldn't. These sectarian. In a place like Turkey, sectarian. sectarian identity.
Does he always do that when you say Turkey? Have you trained him to like? It must be a lot worse when you say Erdogan.
I apologize for that, guys, but
it happens.
No apology necessary.
I don't know how he got in. I thought I'd locked the door. He's beginning to.
He's learning.
He's learning. But what? No, I agree. In places like Turkey and in places like Egypt, the sectarian divisions that have become rarefied weren't rarefied by colonialists, right? So I don't blame. But I would say, like, Israel, Palestine.
Oh yeah. No.
Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. The places where you had some of the most invasive colonial rule in the Middle East, not doing great.
I'm not trying to exculpate colonialism. I'm just saying that, like, it bothers me when it's used as
a unilateral explanation.
No,
exactly.
I completely agree. I think that and I like to call it dime store Orientalism, where you have like people. Middle Easterners, often on the political right, mobilizing the discourse of Saadian Orientalism to basically wash their hands of like any critique directed towards sectarian policies they might be conjuring for their own political project. So I agree, Kuba, 100%. Like political leaders had agency at decolonization to abolish these kind of sectarian divisions, which they didn't, right? Which they took on in order to maintain power, right?
I don't know much about Libya. I think Gaddafi may have had the most, like the most sincere effort, the most game effort to do that. But he was a weirdo.
He was a weirdo.
A wonderful, beautiful weirdo.
Algeria was a bit of a different case, which,
Yes.
But, Algeria's national cohesion was built on basically, the M-wording the French population. Like basically ejecting the French population from...
Incidentally, that's what the Israelis are afraid of.
Yeah, that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid of Sanaria, Algeria, because that's the that's
the end game.
That's a model for national consolidation, right?
Mm-hmm.
You find and Algeria is not fully national, and Algeria benefits from having natural gas and oil and a relatively developed state structure they inherited from the French as well.
But they never send them birthday cards.
But they never send birthday cards. I have to pick up a naked baby again. It keeps breaking up.
I guess one last note we can talk about, and then we'll kind of wrap this up. So we have noted that in the West, particularly in Europe and the United States, although for probably vastly different reasons, there has been an uptick of BDS sentiment. If we are honest, how likely is that to affect U.S. politics? I know we have, squad members or whatever saying good things about Palestine and Israeli conflict, particularly Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib. But I often, when I hear leftist social democrats or even harder leftists start getting really excited about that, I start to try to remind them about the relative size of that both constituency and voting bloc, which is 6, 7, 8 people, 1 senator, maybe 2.
So,
what can you do about that? And what in the United States should people be heartened by this political change, or is it leftist cheerleading that won't matter? And
well, I think it's leftist cheerleading, but the jury's out.
Still out on if it matters.
Yeah. And if I think about, if I like play out the pattern 20, 30 years down the road, it's sort of in 2/3 of scenarios, it doesn't matter. And in 1/3, because of certain other elements fall into place, it does create a material difference, which ultimately, and in like 10% of that 1/3, Israeli policy changes. So there's a very small and very contingent path for BDS having a material impact, but
It's not nothing.
It's not nothing. Yeah, it's the shift in attitude is generational, right? And in some ways, what's more important isn't that more Americans are caring about Palestine, it's that fewer Americans care about Israel. And as a result, when they're confronted with the objective reality of what happens in the occupation, they pretty quickly are like, no, the Israelis are the dicks here. And yeah, we shouldn't be giving them guns, right? Like they can shoot them with Russian guns or Chinese guns, right? Like we don't need to be part of this. And that's one reason why the Israeli government and the big tech platforms are move very strongly to quash criticism of Israel. They understand that that's something that could potentially germinate into conditions that would make Israel pretty uncomfortable. Like there's a lot of technology that the Israeli that the IDF depends on, which is coming out of the DoD, and it is an American unilateral decision to say no, you can't have this. Also, the Israelis spy on, they steal technology a lot, and they generally get away with it. Slap on the wrist, or it's retroactively legalized. But if you started treating them like you would a different country, then conditions in terms of the high-tech hard power that Israel can muster, they start to deteriorate, and that becomes a concern.
I mean, if Israel does something like, I was having a dispute with someone on Facebook about whether Turkey or Israel ever get held accountable for anything. And he was like, well, Turkey, this Turkish nationalist I know, was, Turkey is being held accountable for, purchasing the S-400 air defense system from Russia. And it's like, well, yeah, they don't get held accountable for like human rights violations or anything. They get held accountable by the United States when they start like messing with the military industrial complex and compromising American military technology. So if suddenly Israel, for some bizarre reason, decided to buy Russian air defense systems and Chinese more and more Chinese technology, I think that is more likely to trigger a harder line American response, which may be framed in humanitarian terms, but probably won't be. That is the most likely scenario and I don't think the Israelis are reckless enough to provoke the United States by doing something like buying a Russian air defense system or potentially compromising.
Then again, Jonathan Pollard and what was the name? There was an American naval vessel, a destroyer, that nearly got sunk by the Israeli Air Force during the Yom Kippur War, I think.
Yes.
And they knew it was American. Kind of an act of war. They did it anyway. They got away with it. So
yeah, but killing American soldiers is very different from selling weapons.
So Jonathan Pollard, he spied on
America,
on the United States for Israel, and the information that went to Israel then ended up going to the Soviet Union and killed and rolled up an entire CIA intelligence network that they had established inside of Moscow. So that seems like a big deal, eh?
We're in the post-Cold War era, but yes, maybe they can get away with.
They caught him in the Cold War era.
Well, they let him go as well. Trump let him go, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
So it's clear that there's an Israeli blank check, and I don't know how I don't know what level of abuse it would take.
Well, even the S-440, even the S-40, 400 that Turkey bought, Turkey's frozen out
on the wrist.
They've frozen out of the F-35s program.
Yeah, which they may have dodged a bullet there.
Yeah, and also, they're still purchasing, what is it, the Leopard from Germany, and the Army, U.S. bases haven't been. Incirlik hasn't been. There's not just Incirlik. There's tons of them across.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to. I want to soften a little what I said. If right now there's a certain cognitive capture among American leaders about the relationship with Israel, like Israel is essentially seen from American defense circles as like the unsinkable aircraft carrier. Like they give the United States certain strategic options, intelligence gathering, right? Like logistics and other types of capabilities that would not otherwise be available, and therefore it's worth putting up with, the occasional spying and the occasional, sinking of an American destroyer. But although that position is pervasive, that assessment is pervasive, it is not the only one. It's possible that there are revisionists inside the American sort of defense industrial complex that don't think that the Israeli alliance is a good one. If they were empowered, maybe through some kind of BDS triggered overall reassessment of American-Israeli relations, then that blank check may no longer exist.
It'd be interesting, though, in the U.S. context. I actually don't know whether that withdrawal of the blank check comes more from the right or the left. I mean, right now, I'd say it would be more likely from the left because of popular support. But geopolitically, the instantiations, to wrap that down, have so far actually come from more right-wing elements in the military, such as Mateus, in particular, who's still a pretty standard military guy in most ways. And, I remember a certain kind of paleo-conservative softness towards him 10 years ago. And, I'd be interested in what sectors of the U.S. defense establishment are actually more revisionist versus what sectors of the U.S. political establishment, because I think we might find that they're not exactly copacetic with one another if they don't line up.
You'd need a red-brown alliance, actually.
Yeah.
So
got to get those leftists on board.
It is. Well, I mean, I was thinking about like the institute that comes to mind is the Quincy Institute, which has
which is the Red-Brown Alliance,
which is Danny Bessner on one hand, and then Andrew Bacevich, someone who, when I was a right winger in my early 20s, I was well aware of as an anti-war right winger, so I know that world well. I've often laughed at in American politics right now when we have this red-brown stuff that we're kind of joking about. Right now, it's over stupid social democratic issues. It's like not even it doesn't really make that much political sense. But on geostrategic stuff, it kind of does.
Well, there's historical precedent for it. If you look back to the anti-imperialist leagues of the early, late 19th, early 20th century, you have
the mugwumps were sided with racists
and socialists against expanding American empire for radically different reasons, but the functionality of the policy was to stop American empire. Like, I am not very sympathetic to Red-Brown Alliance kind of talk, because I think that's the way to, like, the best case scenario for
usually brown kills the red eventually domestically.
The best case scenario is that you end up like the Syrian Communist Party, and you kind of like, you're allowed 3 seats in the parliament, and you can clap to the dictator, in the inverted commas progressive anti-imperialist front, right? But in foreign policy, on very limited issues like that, I think that is the most fruitful area, at least. And this is basically in terms of congressional maneuvering, even. It's not even on a kind of mass level. It's good that Bernie Sanders and, what's the guy from your state, Mike Lee, like, didn't want to do the stuff anymore. That kind of like ad hoc alliance kind of, I mean, not to say Mike Lee is brown, but I kind of see libertarianism as kind of like,
well, I mean, Mike Lee's also not a consistent libertarian, but yeah.
Soft social Darwinism.
I mean, I talked to Mike McManus on the right. I'll have other right-wing specialists on in the future. But for I would tell people, for example, I don't broke like we need to appeal to conservatives in our voter bloc for domestic issues, but I'll talk to people from the Quincy Institute in a heartbeat, regardless of whether or not they're a socialist. So like, and I still don't have, I got conservapilled by antiwar.com and the idiocy of International Answer in the early aughts. And I don't mind even being explicit about that. But I also know that, like, when I read international policy news, if it doesn't have a pro-war bent at all, I still actually often do have to read stuff that is sympathetic to paleo conservatives. And that is in libertarians, and that is stuff like antiwar.com. But I also think you have to keep that on strategic, just on these international foreign policy issues. That's where I stand on it. But I think that's something we have to talk about, because the Bidens of the world are and their next generation down are not softening their Israel stance, or even a lot of Middle Eastern policy stances anytime real soon. They might, because they have to, like for example, I know there's if you read left Twitter and left Facebook, there are people like, Biden's gonna throw us into a war immediately, and I'm like, no, because we're actually just not in the material, like, there's no material way for us to have a whole bunch of big major wars. And I don't think China wants a direct war. I mean, China and the United States want a direct war either, even though you've had that bellicosity there.
Even Iran, mm-hmm. The biggest danger with Iran was from Trump bungling, right? Mm-hmm. Bungling into a war. But what's America going to do, right? Are you going to launch? Are you going to send? What would you need to invade Iran? Like 1 million men to invade Iran? Fight across, like, Iran is a bowl made up of mountains with a desert in the middle, right?
Yeah, no. They love democracy. As soon as they know the Americans are coming, they're going to overthrow the Ayatollahs, and they're going to have like a Philadelphia in Tehran, and it's gonna be great. It's gonna be great. They're gonna have a constitution and everything.
I honestly think the kind of realists, there's like, I think there's the delusional anti-Iranian crowd and there's the realist anti-Iranian crowd. So the delusionists think that like they can launch a war. Like, I don't know where they're going to find 1 million men to invade Iran from. Because what was it? I mean,
Mujahideen Khalq will do it for them, right?
The maniacs, but the realists, they want to turn Iran into Assyria. You send in someone like Mujahideen Khalq, like a complete like bonkers death cult. You provide weapons to Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis on the borders, and you end up with like sort of intractable war inside, an intractable kind of ethnic war inside Iran. So you
just break it.
You break it. Like, they don't have,
you expand Dar al-Harb from the Mediterranean to Pakistan.
And if we think that Syria was bad, like like these countries are unstable. Even Turkey, like Erdogan's administration has, Turkey is an authoritarian state, but it had strong institutions, right? It had like a military, it had all these things. Erdogan is eviscerating any independent space of political power and centralizing both through, they amended the constitution, and they want to amend the constitution again, so you have this, so you have these regimes, which could very easily descend into some kind of, like Iran is more plausible than Turkey, but I wouldn't have thought Turkey was capable of like devolving into some kind of civil war. I was shocked. I was very surprised by the 2016 coup, right? I was like shocked that took place, and that
I was shocked that it happened when it did. Like 3 years earlier, they could have pulled it off, but it feels like they waited too long.
Yeah, they wait. I mean, in Turkey, you had like, by that point, you had a generation of like lower ranking officers who had come into power under the under Erdogan, and with officer corps, you have to think generationally, right? Yeah. Because people move in, and I'm not an expert on the Turkish military apparatus, but now the Turkish military is dominated by like Islamists and Eurasianists. But both Iran and Turkey are very fragile states at the moment, and America, a bombing campaign and some strategically, placed weapon caches could set off like a disaster. But I don't think the Biden administration wants to deal with that kind
ironically enough, I think that the Iranian state has gotten stronger as a result of things like the abortive Green Revolution. Like they've seen certain Western kind of color revolution tactics, how they play out, the use of social media or electronic communication to coordinate, how opposition groups can spring up, how they mobilize quickly. And that experience is good to get the state agencies, the state security apparatus, to become more effective at preempting it. I think structurally you're right. There is a lot of vulnerability, but and I'm not talking about the entire state apparatus, just the security.
But it's also important to remember that the Green Revolution was essentially a fight within the Iranian political establishment, because ultimately ultimately in Iran, the kind of the hardliner versus reformist divide. There's a certain amount of difference on domestic policy, but they coalesce around the principle of the Islamic Republic. Their main difference is on the posture towards the United States, and as a generation in Iran grows up, the legitimacy of the regime, particularly as the political economy of Iran, sort of develops in the way that it does with this high Gini coefficient, the sanctions on one hand serve to enhance the economic power of those with connections with the regime. If you have special access to a good rate of US dollars, the official dollar rate, you can buy up all the properties of those people who don't have close relations to the regime. So I think, the Iranian state is not Saddam Hussein's Iraq. The Iraqi state was extremely brittle. Turkey and Iran are much stronger states. There's much more national cohesion, at least amongst majority populations. You obviously in Iran and Turkey you have national minorities which are like not very well integrated. But like the danger with Iran is that it turns into a big fat Syria, and like God knows what's going to happen.
What I'll only add into that, Djene, that we have to consider that Russia has regional interest in all this, and Syria has proven they're no longer afraid to not mess our day up. We are, in one way, I think U.S. hegemony is probably not as imperiled as a lot of people think it is, and another way, we are in a multipolar world, and things resemble a lot more like, I don't know, the time period right before World War One, which is not predicting a world war because nuclear arms are rule a lot of that out. But I am predicting like the way you model state interaction and the way that these internal conflicts can degenerate into proxy conflicts real fast, will change U.S. calculations, even in a place like Iran, even with unstable regimes. And in fact, unstable regimes is part of why it's going to be a more proxy heavy, situation. I mean, Koba may disagree with me on that, but we're going to talk more about that on Monday. On the general, how things are right now. I'll let both of you have a last word on this, back on Israel-Palestine issues, and maybe so people know. Kuba will be back on Monday. We're talking about why everyone misunderstands the U.S. intelligence apparatus and how they're kind of stupid. And that isn't the word that he would use, but I like to say things a little bit directly sometimes. Although, no, you may actually say they're stupid. I don't know.
I still have friends in Washington.
All right.
They don't call him State Kuba for nothing.
What I've learned about watching, as a side note, what I've learned about watching American intelligence and international foreign policy is it actually takes a certain amount of brilliance to screw up that bad. I'll leave it at that. And we'll talk more about that on Monday. Part of it is to dispel, trends on the left where people basically think the CIA runs the world, which is hilarious to me. We'll get to that. Djene, last word, and then Kuba, last word.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered pretty much everything we could cover about this, but yeah, it's a tragic situation. And, on a human level, I at least hope this kind of latest round of violence, just stops, and, people can, not be living in fear of Israeli airstrikes, police brutality, and rockets. None of that really is a positive thing. And I hope people can have a peaceful Eid, and just at least have a couple of moments of normalcy to kind of enjoy with friends, family, and things like that. There's not much else to say other than I think we covered all the politics.
What this has made me think of is how one of the fundamental human social questions is, how do we deal with diversity? If we have communities where everyone instinctively, by growing up together, usually understands that this is kind of it, this is my world, and these are the people who live in it, and we share the same community, we're the same, then I think that's a condition that people find comfortable, reassuring. When you introduce the stranger, whatever complexion, whatever their origin, when you introduce more than one type of person, then society has to change and adjust. And Djene mentioned that in the Middle East, there was this institutionalization and reification of sectarian identity. In the United States, the same thing happens with race. In European countries, ethnicity often played that same role. Pole, German, Swede, newcomer, right? Asylum seeker. The people know who belongs and people know who doesn't. Some societies try to change, try to create new forms of community or new bases of solidarity so that at least everyone shares something. I think Canada is actually particularly good at it. New Zealand, the Singapore. And
but note those are all very small population countries. So,
to a certain extent, Russia has
that's our hope.
Has the Российский-Русский distinction, where not every you don't have to be Ruski to be Российский, and to be Российский is enough to belong. Mind you, your prize is belonging in Russia, so. But
yeah. I think about the cosmic rasa, the cosmic race stuff in Mexico, which is also pretty good at integrating people.
And I think that that's going to become like one of the most crucial meta challenges of how we face the dislocation that comes with climate change, as well as the polarization of economic growth and the increase of tensions that, let's face it, the world has become more and more dangerous since we were teenagers, and when it was going to be Starbucks and McDonald's forever, and Microsoft was the coolest, and Bill and Melinda seemed like they'd be happy together.
Oh, our neoliberal overlords and their divorces. But yeah, and on that note, we will end. I got to do a little bit of podcasty business, so I will see you guys in a second. So like and subscribe if you want more analysis like this. I'm sure people will find it super upbeat, but we're going to be honest with you. If you want more of this, or you want an audio feed, let's say you don't want to sit in front of a YouTube and watch this, we do produce these as podcasts. However, I don't think this one will be available as a podcast for non-patrons. Patrons get the audio feed. In fact, you'll get this in about a half an hour. So if you're interested, you can find the link there. I would like to thank Djene and Kuba for coming on. They've been making the circuits a lot recently because when everyone needs a foreign policy specialist, they seem to be around. And I would like to thank the various other panelists we invited. Unfortunately, they're all in high demand right now, and it's Eid. So you might be hearing from them in the future as well. So again, like and subscribe. If you want more, find our Patreon. If you want to if you want to hear audio of this because you don't want to sit in front of your TV all day and watch people talk at you, there will be an audio version of most of these for free on a link that's also available on this channel. And I have to do 2 patron shout outs because this is what we all do now in the busker economy. Tiberius Graskis and Justin Hugil. This is your shout out for being officers in the Varn blog, and that means you are our highest tier patron supporter and you get your name dropped. Thank you. And with that, good night.